Hi all. Welcome to tonight's Fair in Medicine webinar on antidepressant diagnosis, treatment, and risks. I'm Monica Harris. I'm Executive Director of FAIR, and I will be hosting this discussion in Dr. Johnson's absence as her family was hit hard by Hurricane Debbie, and she's currently without power. Tonight's webinar is the latest in our series to help you understand how vital informed consent is, whether you're a doctor or a patient. We began exploring this topic some months ago in our efforts to broaden the scope of fair in medicine and examine the root cause of systemic dysfunctions in the practice of medicine. We plan to continue this discussion with several webinars aimed to help all of us better understand how vital informed consent is to all of our health. Informed consent is a process that gives important information to patients about possible benefits, side effects, risks, and alternatives to a specific medical treatment, drug, procedure, test, or clinical trial. And the purpose of informed consent is to provide patients with not some, but all of the information they need to make a proper risk versus benefit or cost-benefit analysis so that they can make an educated decision about their care or participation in clinical trials, and they know what to expect. But it's also important to keep in mind that patients can only be informed if their doctors are also informed. So it's imperative that healthcare professionals providing informed consent also be fully informed themselves, that they be transparent with the information, and they be available to answer all of the patient's questions. Now, here's why this is important. Roughly 29% of Americans are concerned that they do not know the risks of the medications that are prescribed to them. They're concerned about a lack of transparency about all the possible effects from a wide variety of drugs and medications, from puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, prescription opioids, benzodiazepines, and even COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. And as a result, this lack of transparency has a lot more people, many Americans, distrusting the medical system. It's estimated that nearly 18% of all Americans are currently being treated for depression, a number that jumped, this is unbelievable, 63% since the pandemic and has skyrocketed among young women. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, otherwise known as SSRIs, are the #1 prescribed treatment for depression. But more patients now are wondering if their doctor or therapist is providing informed consent about these drugs. Diagnosis and treatment for depression is the focus of tonight's webinar, and we are thrilled to welcome clinical psychologist Roger McFillin, to educate us tonight. Dr. McFillin is a board-certified clinical psychologist and executive director of the Center for Integrated Behavioral Health in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He's one of the preeminent critics of the psychiatric diagnostic system and the harms of psychiatric drugs. Dr. McFillin hosts the Radically Genuine podcast, which has propelled itself into the top 1% of global downloads. And if you enjoy our conversation with Dr. McFillin tonight, I highly, highly encourage you to check out his podcast. He's also the founder of the new nonprofit, fair-aligned organization, the Conscious Clinician Collective, which aims to align like-minded mental health care practitioners who prioritize informed consent and medical freedom. The Conscious Clinician Collective is in its early fundraising stage and aims to create a comprehensive platform to allow patients to find local clinicians and gain access to critical information that's not being shared in the mainstream medical establishment and can be vital to helping patients make informed decisions about their mental health. So, Dr. McFillin, welcome to tonight's webinar.
Monica, it is an honor to be here tonight. See that you're in a beautiful island. I hope you're enjoying your vacation and appreciate you being here.
It was worth it to be interrupted for this, for nothing else though.
Great.
Okay, so let's just, we have 90 minutes. We don't want to waste any time. I've spoken enough, so I'll let you get into it. Dr. McFillin, can you just give our audience just an overview of antidepressants? Let's put it this way, an overview of what clinical depression is, how it's diagnosed, and how antidepressants are used to treat depression.
Well, let's first start with the identification of depression. And what you notice by just examining history is our understanding and the way we communicate depression certainly has evolved and changed with culture and time. Right now, I think it's very difficult for most of the general public to fully understand what that word even means. It's kind of devolved into an umbrella term that represents any experience in life that is rather prolonged, where it could incorporate sadness, loneliness, fatigue, sleep problems, and so forth. How it's supposed to be diagnosed is through something called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual is a categorical representation of symptoms. They are rather arbitrary. They are developed by the medical model. So it's a biomedical kind of understanding of depression in terms of a medical disease. Although it's communicated from a biopsychosocial perspective, in the medical world, it's pretty much treated as a medical condition that's identified as major depressive disorder. Now, the challenges that I have with the concept of depression is it's been reduced to a series of symptoms, and one would have to meet 5 out of the 9 criteria for a relatively short amount of time, and that's only 2 weeks. And so you see that it increases the prevalence rate of depression because it encapsulates very normal aspects of living. If you just followed the DSM, most human beings are going to go through what we call a depressive episode. Now, if we medicalize it and we talk about it as if it is a disease, the identification around that is it is something external. It is something within us, and it requires a medical intervention. That's going to do a couple things. It's going to increase the number of people who turn to a medical professional to say, hey, I am not feeling well. Can you help me? Now, this is a big shift from traditionally how depression was understood. Depression was probably best understood as a response to legitimate setbacks in life. Living is very, very challenging. You go through loss and trials and tribulations. In some cultures, depression might even be viewed as a natural transformational process, that your emotions are guides to help you solve and face problems. So if you're in an abusive environment, you've lost your job, you're lonely, that should be an aversive emotional state that would drive change, right? Leave an unhealthy or dangerous situation, take care of your health, develop new relationships, right? It's kind of a guide in order to drive that change. But now it's been misrepresented, and it's kind of misrepresented as something that one would have to take care of in a similar way that you would have to take care of another medical condition. And so that medicalization of it drives the use of pharmaceutical drugs. And the use of pharmaceutical drugs are, generally speaking, 2 classes, SSRIs and SNRIs. And so it sent a clear message to the Western world, and in the United States in particular, that the use of direct-to-consumer advertising, it's been the communication that it can be treated like any other condition, almost like insulin for diabetes, that there's an underlying brain condition related to key neurochemicals. And even though this isn't any established science, it was really promoted from a marketing perspective to the American public to shift the way that we think about this experience. So it's really jumped. Has there been conditions historically that represent severe depression? Absolutely. Severe depression, although quite rare when you consider it within the context of the general population, it has existed. You can go back centuries. It's called melancholy. People do die by suicide. People do withdraw, have experienced chronic, severe emotional distress that's unremitting. It's just that definition now has expanded greatly to include a lot more people than it ever has before. And that messaging has had powerful impacts by driving people to pharmaceutical drugs. And so for tonight, what we're going to talk about is, are there safety and efficacy concerns around antidepressants? When would they be used? Are they effective? What alternatives exist? What do we know about that science to be able to inform people to make critical decision making about their own mental health?
So it's interesting. I'm I'm thinking about Abigail Schreier, who's written a lot about this recently. And there's also, I was reading in the Free Press today, there was an article about a new documentary. I think it's called Thank You for Sharing. And it explores the boom in mental health care. I don't know if you're familiar with that and why, so many Americans are miserable in spite of all the health care the help they're getting. And you're talking about pathologizing natural and normal behavioral conditions. 43% of American adults report feeling more anxious than they had the previous year, which is like 37% in 2023. And it's really high among Gen Z. And I just wondered if you could briefly touch on what's causing this pathologizing of what is always, I think we always saw in this culture, many cultures, as natural and normal behavioral patterns. What's driving this? Are we, like why you mentioned, for example, it's the criteria for being diagnosed with depression is it's pretty slight, 2 weeks feeling anxious, let's say. Why did has the medical profession shifted its focus or its criteria to make it so much easier to diagnose someone with depression? If that makes sense.
Yeah, there's no doubt this is the impact of the pharmaceutical industry.
Hmm.
And the pharmaceutical industry has done an incredible job of marketing their drugs to try to treat the human condition. So if you had a market for psychiatric drugs and their overall use was only for a very small percentage of the most severe mental health conditions, the most impairing, it's not a very large market. Human beings are incredibly resilient. These challenges that we go through are generally episodic. They're short term, they're in response to stressors, and we're able to figure that out. We're able to solve problems, we're able to face them, we're able to endure hardships and poverty and loss and famine and wars and all these things throughout history. So we're very resilient. The only way that you're going to increase the sales of your drugs is by increasing the prevalence and identification with the condition.
Mm-hmm.
And so the pharmaceutical companies right now, about 80 to 85% of antidepressant drugs are estimated to be prescribed in primary care centers. Historically, primary care physicians were not comfortable working in this realm. And there was a marketing executive at Pfizer who, his name was Howard Kroplik, who believed that the way to increase revenue for antidepressants is by twofold: being able to communicate to the general public that there is a safe option to be able to feel better in life. Now, human beings always had this natural vulnerability and tendency to seek out altered states of consciousness. We drink alcohol, we smoke marijuana, you experiment with drugs. Life can be very challenging, and it is part of the human condition to try to alter consciousness. Some people cope very well with the struggles of living, while others are always turning to some sort of escape mechanism. So that creates a large percentage of people that can begin to identify with some kind of potentially like a quick response or a quick fix to what they're feeling. But you have to have the primary care doctors on board. So they created a symptom checklist. And this is part of the development of this reductionist viewpoint that depression can be reduced to a few key symptoms. And in those symptoms, although regardless of cause, they can be widely applied to lots of different people in different situations. Context is really important. In the mental health side of things, whether you're a therapist or a psychologist, we often spend hours, numbers of sessions evaluating and understanding somebody in the context of their own life and able to support them to change. In medical profession, in primary care centers, the average time is about 8 to 10 minutes, if that. So they created a PHQ-9, which is this quick symptom checklist that is going to create a number of false positives. And it was part of their marketing plan to create this disguise of evidence-based medicine. So if you go into your primary care center now and they give you these screeners for depression, by no means does that screener reflect a true understanding of what depression means. It's a very simplistic way of marking off aspects of the human condition that a lot of people experience at different times. So, for example, one could have difficulty with sleep, and it has nothing at all to do with a depressive episode. You can experience a number of things on a PHQ-9 that are not necessarily related to what we would traditionally view as severe clinical depression. So it's got very poor, what we call construct validity. And of course, it has poor construct validity because it's not developed by scientists. It's really developed by a marketing team. And so that's created a comfort level as almost an evidence-based approach, along with very strong and heavy marketing by the pharmaceutical companies to try to mass kind of condition doctors that, you know, we have this available tool that can ease the suffering of people who aren't doing well. And of course, that has expanded dramatically, Monica. It extends way beyond what it originally was intended to. We even use this marketing term, antidepressant. Language matters. It's extremely powerful. So people believe, oh, there's a drug that's an antidepressant, like an antibiotic. Like I can take this and it can remove this from me. And then it's widely applied to anxiety, medical conditions, number of conditions that have never been evaluated for safety or efficacy. But we see this dramatic increase in the prescription of these drugs, despite real genuine safety and efficacy concerns, and applying it to groups of people and populations that had never at any other point would have met criteria for clinical depression. And now you have a multi-billion-dollar revenue generating industry that was created through this diagnostic expansion and this conditioning of the general public to think about their mental health in new ways. Now, you mentioned Abigail Shrier, who brings up these really important points, is there's the more that we focus on our own pain, the more we think about what is happening internally with us. It's a paradoxical effect. You tend to feel worse. When you are struggling and you might be in a rough mood state or a difficult place in your life, the most effective treatments and the most effective therapies are driving your attention outward to face those things in your life, to solve those problems. You know, still to this day, the most effective, if I use that word, antidepressant, is something called behavioral activation that includes exercise, like moving the body, getting out of your head, getting back into your life, and solving problems. Now, one might have valid and legitimate conditions, and their emotions are valid reactions to those situations, but it doesn't stop us from having to cope with them to improve our experience, right? That's very, very ingrained in us. But shifting the cultural narrative to say it's a medical disease actually inhibits our ability to do that. We're actually driving ourselves into the doctor's office to view it from a new perspective and hoping that this corrects some underlying imbalance that exists in our brain, and then we will feel better. And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. You have to start asking really critical questions. If we have all these available, quote unquote, evidence-based treatments, why are we suffering more with these clinical conditions at any other point in history? There's a 1,000-fold increase in the diagnosis of depression since antidepressants came to market.
Very good. Wow. You know, and this phrase antidepressants, it's in my mind, it's sort of similar to the opioid crisis, in which pharmaceutical companies demonized pain. Remember the pain scale? I forgot that you know what that's called, right? There was this spectrum of pain that doctors were presented patients with constantly, or even a little pain or a lot of pain. The idea is that we were being conditioned not to handle any pain. Pain was anathema. And now it seems like we're being similarly conditioned to not handle any depression. So we're being put in this real just artificial state of just like being incredibly fragile instead of being anti-fragile.
Yeah, I call it the war on emotions.
Oh, interesting.
Right? Because allopathic medical doctors are kind of trained from a perspective that symptoms are representing an underlying disease state, and they can categorize and diagnose based on those symptoms. And then the absence of symptoms means one person is at health. You know, so if I no longer have a fever and a sore throat, and I'm not demonstrating those symptoms, then my body, you know, has essentially fought that infection. Trying to apply that to the complexity of human emotions, which have evolved and are certainly necessary to our survival, to our personal connection. Even feeling bad is meaningful to our experience, right? So if you condition generations to think that if they are anxious or if they are sad, that it is a problem, that there is something wrong with them, we are driving them to judge that experience and to try to escape it. When the truth of the matter is, and everything we know about, people who've overcome hardship or even effective psychotherapies that work, is the way out is often the way in. It's like we face things completely, we feel completely, we learn from that experience. The light and the dark exist together, love and loss exist together. It's part of the whole tapestry of human emotions, but collectively we've kind of lost our language of suffering. So if culturally you're not communicating what is normal, or even the value of struggle, or the value of emotional pain, well, then you're believing that just as experience means that there's something wrong with you. So I've seen this shift as a clinical psychologist. The word sad doesn't even exist anymore. Clients who come in to see me describe any negative emotional state as my depression. My depression has come back. And of course, I'm going to investigate, well, what does that mean? Because in my mind, depression, when it's in its most severe form, is extremely impairing. It's prolonged. Many clients are, want to end their life. They're not taking care of themselves physically. They're not showering. They're not brushing their teeth. They feel just weighed down. And that's a serious condition. And that's what I've been trained to be able to help those people. But now it's the normal experiences. I was depressed this weekend. Well, tell me what you were feeling. I was bored and lonely, right? My depression came back. Now it's representing a sense of just loneliness. Or someone's on social media and there's a social comparison and they're seeing their friends are out and having, fun, and now they're inward and they're feeling rejected. And so we don't have this complex language necessarily to communicate our struggle. So we use that word depression. Now, fast forward, you say that to the wrong person, you go into the medical system and you say that to your doctor, I have depression. They're not doing a lot of, they're not analyzing that. They're not understanding what the person means. They're not sitting down with the person for 90 minutes and then scheduling follow-ups. No, it's like a quick 8-minute, well, I have something for you. And, they're conditioned to believe that there's this safe drug. It's marketed as antidepressants. This can help you through a difficult time because that's what my guidelines say. I'm provided these general guidelines to treat depression, although these primary care doctors are certainly not experts in this area to even assess and evaluate it. So you can see why this has just jumped dramatically, and so many people are drawn to wanting to take this drug. And I think the last numbers I've been looking at is more than 20% of adults are on an antidepressant drug.
Yeah.
And we see it rising in some of the most vulnerable populations, adolescents, where the drug is even probably the most dangerous.
Now, what about situations where ongoing depression is triggered by physical pain, ongoing physical pain, maybe from a car accident, rather than situational depression? Oh, my boyfriend left me. Would the treatment, would it be different? The diagnosis be different? Well, diagnosis is different, but how about the treatment?
Well, one thing about treating depression, and I say this all the time, is that I never meet the same person twice. So it is extremely individualized. So we're even going to use the medicalized words. Like that's how we are in the United States culture. Treatment, right? That word treatment is, it's very medicalized. But really the way a psychologist would work, or I would work, I might end up using that word because I'm just as conditioned as everyone else. But the truth is I'm developing a relationship with somebody. I'm assessing everything that is leading to them to cope that way. And I'm trying to understand what's getting in the way of living a full life. And that can be quite comprehensive, right? It could be the way that they see their world, the way they see themselves, their relationship to pain, their relationship to anxiety, their lifestyle. So there's a lot of things that can manifest itself under those symptoms of depression. So somebody, for example, is metabolically ill. Somebody has sleep problems. Somebody's overworked. Someone spends 8 to 12 hours on a screen. There's a number of things that can lead people to not feel well. It's part of my job to understand what they are and to work with them to make changes in those areas, because I'm coming from a different perspective. your emotions are not symptoms of an illness. Your emotions are guides. They're very important information. And if we're not feeling well in any way, we need to be able to pay attention to that and understand it. Let's see it as a transformational experience. Let's not see it as an illness to be treated. So in your example, somebody who might be experiencing pain, well, there could be a real legitimate impairment in their quality of their life. Maybe they were an active person and they generated a lot of joy and purpose from being active. Maybe they have an idea of what their life means now with living with this pain.
Mm.
And then I can go into the science around pain management. And we know that the more that we fixate on pain, the higher a person, more intense the person might experience it. So they might be coping in a way with pain that actually makes them feel more pain. And we know that there's also a correlation between emotional pain and physical pain. So some people will experience intense emotional pain, and this is inflammatory too in the body, and it exacerbates and intensifies existing pain. So even some of the interventions that exist for pain management can be very medical. Um, and but there's a lot of psychological components to managing pain. So my point is it's a bit complex, and we've reduced this in our culture, and we've tried to make quick, simple fixes to try to I think in a lot of ways support an industry, and it's led to a wide scale misrepresentation of what the drugs do, what the conditions are, and alternative ways to be able to work with it.
Okay, one quick question we got just before we move on to how SSRIs work. When the 20% statistic that you mentioned, 20% of Americans are on an antidepressant. Does this include people who were once on antidepressants, but got off, but still suffer the lasting effects? Or is it people who are currently taking them right now? Because I imagine
Yeah,
there are.
good question. Yeah, we don't have really great data on this because the post 2020 data is not really come through. I couldn't find anything reliable on this. So what I can tell people is that as we moved closer to 2019, we started creeping up to that 20% mark of any one time 20% of the population was on an antidepressant. I can only imagine that has increased pretty significantly post 2020, because what I see in clinical practice is, there was a time, I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that a percentage of my clients would come in to see me already started on maybe one antidepressant. Now it is rare for me to meet anybody who isn't on multiple psychiatric drugs. So
Multiple?
multiple, yes. And it has shifted rather dramatically, which is one of the reasons why I have become so outspoken.
Wait, I'm sorry, Roger. You're saying that you can take multiple, when you say multiple antidepressants, or is it antidepressant plus another type of anti-anxiety, or?
Yeah. I'm seeing, Monica, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds on 7 psychiatric drugs. It extends beyond any bounds of safety or efficacy.
Wow.
It's all off label. It's interacting with each other in ways that have never been evaluated. And my observation is people become a shell of their former self. So a lot of these, like when we say antidepressant, that's a marketing term. I don't believe there's an antidepressant drug. It's a misrepresentation to the public. But this is what the pharmaceutical companies have done, is they use words like mood stabilizing, anti-anxiety, antipsychotic, antidepressant. They're repackaged. So a drug that is a sedative that has traditionally been used as sedative for many potential reasons gets repackaged as a mood stabilizer. There are powerful drugs that are anti-anxiety. They're called benzodiazepines, but those benzodiazepines are extremely dangerous. Dependence is created very early on. You require more and more of the drug to have the same result. And so like a drug like a benzodiazepine might help somebody feel calmer in that particular moment. But the longer they take the drug, they're putting themselves at risk for pretty severe dependence and then experiencing withdrawal reactions that then mimic their original anxiety. Antidepressants are the same way. antidepressants don't universally affect people in a similar way. Antidepressants have a range of reactions to people. Uh, they are mind and mood altering drugs. They are acting on the brain. So when you take them, you do experience a shift in your perception, in your consciousness, in your physiology.
Mhm.
It's just, it varies dramatically on the individual and how they experience it. And that shift in consciousness or that shift in physiology is a drug reaction that gets, again, communicated or misrepresented as if it has antidepressant effects. And part of, I think, my responsibility tonight, and I think it's an important responsibility, is I'm open and I'm clear about what actually happens. Instead of, it's challenging because I've stopped using the word medicine to describe these drugs because that's a misrepresentation. It's
Mhm.
not medicinal. It's not correcting something that there's a deficiency in. There's nothing that says that there are life-saving drugs for us. So it's a complete misrepresentation. These are drugs, and they are inducing chemical imbalances, reactions in the body, and that reaction has a consequence. And people should be aware of what is the consequence to doing that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for, now that we have that overview, and thank you so much. It's been a great foundation. Let's talk about how SSRIs actually work, what they're supposed to do, and what I think there's been a lot of research recently that conflicts with the perception of how SSRIs work or were supposed to work and how they actually work. So why don't you start?
So So theoretically, and I think it's very difficult to confirm this, but
Mhm.
theoretically, they induce the availability of serotonin in the nerve cell. And
But I'm
how,
sorry, why is that important? What is serotonin? Let's start with that maybe for
yeah,
the person.
it's a neurochemical that's a transporter that is theorized to have implications in mood, right? Now, in reality, if you talk to maybe the most advanced neuroscientist in the world and you ask that person, how much do we truly understand about the inner workings of the human brain, consciousness, mood, and mind on a scale of 1 to 10? I think an honest neuroscience would say, boy, it is mysterious. Maybe a 2 or a 3 out of a 10, right? So to simplify our entire human experience or mood to one neurochemical is part of the misrepresentation, the misinformation. That if you can increase the availability of serotonin in the nerve cell in the brain, you will experience a lift in mood. Okay. That was a marketing campaign to justify the use of a drug were that they believed was increasing serotonin, right? Still, I think 80% of people believe that depression and mood are related to chemical imbalances. Now, what's the complicated nature of this, right? Um, I think our minds and our experience and the range of various neurochemicals, whether that's norepinephrine, whether it's dopamine, whether it's serotonin, are in a very complex way interacting with many factors in our brain, lots that we probably don't understand, including our gut and so forth. So let's say if we wanted to improve our mood and increase the availability of chemicals that allow us to feel better. So a lot of people say, I get up in the morning and I do a hard run or a hard workout. I get this high afterwards. I feel really good after the workout.
Mhm.
Or if I get this sun exposure, or I'm around people who I love being around or I'm engaged in work. I feel better when I'm doing these things. And when I'm not doing them, I do not feel well. I think it's an oversimplification to say that, well, I have serotonin and dopamine and these positive neurochemicals running through my mind. And this burst of it is what's leading me to feel this way. I think that's the reductionist kind of approach to this. I think if you create it in a simple way, I think it's more easily digestible and acceptable to the American public to say, I've got something that's imbalanced and I am then correcting it. Now, here's the thing. In 2022, there was an umbrella research study, Joanna Moncrief and her colleagues, examining all the available science and trying to understand the role of serotonin in depression. And it is very definitively clear that serotonin does not play a role in depression. The most severe people, sometimes when it's tested through blood serum levels or other measures, have more serotonin than someone who's not depressed, and vice versa. There's no correlation. There's no relationship at all. So then the question always is, okay, if there's no relationship to serotonin and depression, what do you do when you're trying to artificially increase the amount in your brain? Isn't there some downstream effect? Isn't there some negative consequences when you intervene with nature in a way that nature was not meant to be intervened with? And of course, there are. There are dramatic ones. There are significant ones. But these are not communicated to the doctors. They're not communicated, of course, to the patients.
Okay. So if I'm understanding this correctly, SSRIs were supposed to increase the level of serotonin because serotonin was understood to be a neurochemical that a mood enhancer. It increased your sense of well-being. So increasing serotonin makes you feel better. But the latest research, the study you cited, shows that definitively that there's no correlation necessarily between serotonin levels and your feeling or sense of well-being. Okay.
Yep. No relationship to depression at all.
No words. So my question is, this may seem really kind of stupid, but if that's the case, what was the research decades ago, I imagine, or the study, or the data? What evidence led the FDA to approve a drug based on, I guess, a belief that serotonin had this effect that we now know it doesn't have? How is the ball dropped? What are we missing here?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, because I think the general public assumes that if the FDA approves a drug to market, that it is both safe and it's also proven to be effective. That is not the case. And I think there's been legislation over the years that made it a lot easier to get drugs to market. I think a more accurate way is that the pharmaceutical companies who conduct their own research, which I think is systemically and inherently problematic, obviously because of the bias and their desire to be able to create revenue for their products, like they invest in that. So that's always been difficult for me to understand how we accept that, and there's not some other body that does independent research. But anyway, they have to prove that they have 2 positive clinical trials that outperform a placebo. Okay? 2 positive. Now, here's the kicker, and I don't think people are really going to understand this. I'm not being hyperbolic. You can have 10 trials that show no result, and you can come up with 2 that do, and you can submit them to the FDA, and that can be your approval.
Really? Wow. 2 out of 10.
The other thing that's important is that if you don't conduct a long-term trial, well, then you won't know its harms. So if you keep a trial short, which the antidepressant trials were short, they average in between 8 to 12 weeks. Now,
how do they, and I'm sorry, and in terms of success, and over those 8 to 12 weeks, success is gauged because the patient says on day 1, I feel my sense of well-being is a 1. And on day, 8 to 10 weeks later, the patient says that their sense of well-being is at a 5 or an 8 or whatever. Like, how is success measured if that's?
Good question. What is used is called the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. I don't believe that the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale actually rates depression. I have it in front of me. Okay. First of all, it's administered by the doctor, so it's the doctor's assessment of the condition. Okay.
Not the patients, but the doctors.
Well, the doctor's supposed to be interviewing.
Okay.
Okay. And the doctor makes the assessment on a checklist.
Okay.
So there are some things that are on here that I think represent what clinical depression would look like. Okay. Question one is depressed mood. The doctor has to make an assessment between 0 to 4 on its extreme nature. So it's subjective, right? What I
Subjective
may
from the doctor's perspective.
from the doctor's perspective.
Okay.
Feelings of guilt may or may is another one, may or may not be related to clinical depression, because we all feel guilty without clinical depression. Suicide is on here. Okay. And then that's kind of where some things get a little bit murky after. You have 3 questions about depressed mood, feelings of guilt, suicide. I think you can create, measures, and we have, that are really do get into the nuance of somebody who might be clinically depressed. But there's other things on here. So insomnia is measured 3 times: initial, middle, and delayed. So it's now conflating 2 separate conditions. You can have insomnia and not be depressed. So you can fill out this measure, and it can elevate your depression score when it could be related to something else. The other thing that's important is that, let's say you create a drug that has any sort of sedative kind of effect, and it leads somebody to go to sleep. Maybe not quality sleep, but it leads someone to go to sleep. So if you have a measure that affects some of these physical aspects, and there are a number of them throughout the course of the depression rating scale, you can artificially elevate the effectiveness of the drug and create a positive response to the drug. Okay. Now here's the fascinating thing about the antidepressant trials. That even doing it this way, the trials in a lot of ways had to be manipulated in order to actually outperform a placebo. Here's the interesting thing in the antidepressant clinical trials is that the placebo group got a lot better. So whether it was the placebo or the drug group, both groups made improvement. So our gold standard of evaluation is randomized, blinded, controlled clinical trials. So what should happen is the assessors, the doctors, shouldn't know who got the drug and who got the placebo, right? But in reality, these drugs have such mind and mood altering effects. Almost everyone who got the drug knew they were on the drug, and then so do the doctors. So it automatically breaks blind, right? Mm-hmm. So when you have a doctor that's assessing something, your influence in that impacts the efficacy. And then on the other end, those who got the placebo got substantially better, which is a really interesting ethical aspect of providing informed consent. If you provide somebody an inert substance, but you're still providing other aspects of care. And I think it's important for people to realize that, especially when it comes to someone who may be depressed, if they're being taken seriously, if they're in a medical setting, if they're talking to a doctor, if they think they're doing something for their mental health, even if it wasn't the drug, we're seeing improvements. The other thing that's really important is, and I mentioned this earlier, that depression tends to be episodic. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. It's not, for the most part, it's not really prolonged. There are people who have chronic severe depression, but our moods can be very temporary. So people get better when their stressors resolve themselves or things that change in their mind. So what was very clear from the beginning in these antidepressant trials is that drug companies had a very difficult time distinguishing the drug group from the placebo group. And that same dilemma, that same controversy exists today. When people look at the totality of the research, it's very difficult to say that the drug clinically outperforms a placebo. Now, there is a statistical difference, and this is where people get the misunderstanding of what science is and what science does not. That you can create a statistical difference on a score of the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale between that and a placebo, and it have no clinical relevance. So, for example, The drug group has an average rating scale of 26 on the HAM-D, but the placebo group is 28. So there might be a 2-point difference, but in reality, that means nothing. It's meaningless. Both people are still depressed, and that 2 points has no clinical relevance at all, but you can publish it as a statistical difference. So that's how the drugs came to market.
Interesting. Okay. Is it called the relative efficacy, or I think there's a term for that, right?
Yeah, I always think about it as clinical relevancy, right? If I'm going to make a recommendation to my clients, there's a couple of things that I need to know really clearly occur. First, we know there is a genuine and measurable clinical response in comparison to either no treatment, alternative treatments, or placebo, right? It's really has to have a robust and uh, positive response. When it comes to pharmaceuticals, since pharmaceuticals have side effects and significant side effects, that question is more critical. Why would you put somebody at risk for all those health effects? Some of them severe, some of them potentially fatal. When we have these other options, including a placebo that also demonstrates a very similar clinical response.
Interesting. So now, while we're on the subject of side effects and risks, let's talk about that. Broadly speaking, what are the effects of SSRIs? And it sounds like, not to put words in your mouth, it sounds like the benefits are negligible based on this study, and the dubious relationship or correlation between serotonin and general well-being and mood enhancement. So what are the side effects from these drugs? How long do the side effects last? And we're getting a couple of comments in here. I want to get to these comments later, but is addiction one of these side effects? In other words, might a person who's prescribed SSRIs be permanently just in a constant loop on this medication, and they're never able to wean themselves off?
Before I get to that question, I think I have to make a statement because I know what people are thinking. I've had so many conversations over the years with antidepressants. People are going to ask, but if I do a Google search or I do a PubMed search, I'm going to see a lot of this is published research that shows that this antidepressant drug or that antidepressant drug, whether it's Zoloft, Prozac, Lexapro, outperformed these placebos. And I'm going to say, yes, you're right. You will find that. But unless you really are trained in being able to read the statistics and understanding the studies, you probably will only read the abstract and you'll probably only read the conclusions. And that will be, they will generally say that these drugs are effective for the treatment of depression, and they outperform a placebo. Two things you need to know: that the pharmaceutical companies have hired academics to ghostwrite these papers and to write these conclusions. There's this understanding that if it's in the published medical research, it is representative of the science. That is not true. There's a gentleman by the name of John Ioannidis. He's out of Stanford. He's a meta researcher. He's done a lot of work in psychiatric research. His conclusion is, upwards of 90% of the medical research is flawed. And what that means, generally speaking, is that a lot of the conclusions don't even actually represent the data and are not useful to clinical decision makers. Okay. The other important thing that you have to know is there's something called publication bias. So remember, I mentioned that you only need 2 positive trials for FDA approval. Well, if you only publish the trials that worked in your favor and you file drawer the ones that don't, you do not have an understanding of the totality of the science. You have a portion of the science that was manipulated for the favorable result. So Eric Turner in 2008 published in the New England Journal of Medicine. He was working for the FDA, and he found all this non-published data. And in his paper, he said, according to the published literature, it appeared that 94% of the trials conducted were positive. So if you only look at what was published in a for-profit industry, that 94% were positive. So you get this doctors, myself when I was a graduate student, you get this understanding or this belief that these are highly efficacious. Put safety to the side, but highly effective. After he does this reanalysis, he showed that only 51% were positive. So 49% of the trials negative, 51% of the trials were positive. The totality of the science is withheld from practitioners and the general public. You put it all together, you cannot come to the conclusion that antidepressants outperform a placebo drug. Now we go into the dangers, the harms.
I'm sorry. And before we get into that, I just one question someone raised I think is really important. And I'm just going back to, before we get to side effects, going back to the process by which doctors, clinicians gauge success in their patients, whether they're recovering, whether the SSRIs are actually doing their job. Are you saying that all, or maybe it's not all, most of the doctors who are giving these surveys and prescribing these drugs are fabricating the effectiveness in order to sell more drugs? Or are they just being a little careless? Are they being reckless? You know, are they not being astute enough when they're taking these surveys? Are they not paying close enough attention? Because the question does arise, like, if they're this sloppy and with these surveys, is that legal? Is it malpractice? What's happening here?
So remember, 80 to 85% of the drugs are being prescribed in primary care centers, right? And this is from physicians who are not trained in understanding, treating, or working with mental health. I don't believe that there is a lot of critical analysis in this. There's a lot of just blind acceptance that this is what you do when this is presented and this is reported. If you want to talk about their use in psychiatry, my personal belief is that it's a completely different perspective in how a psychiatrist has been trained. Their entire profession is built on the bedrock that mental health conditions are a brain condition. And so they're part of this biomedical revolution that we dumped billions in evaluation at the government level to try to identify these origins, to treat it like it's a medical condition. It turns out to be wasted money. We've never were able to identify key brain correlates, neurocorrelates, never identified genetic correlates, but it was a big piece of kind of our cultural and medical zeitgeist of 1995 through 2015, right? And so most psychiatrists who are actively practicing and chose that profession have become nothing more than pill dispensers. That is their role in the medical system. So as new science evolves, you see it's a profession that is really hanging on to that idea that they can be integral into the healthcare system and that they have these drugs that work. It's very uncomfortable having critical analysis and conversations with the everyday psychiatrist because it's like part of them understands, and then there's another part of them that is so scared of even the idea that they could be, and these are the good ones, that they could be mistreating, people for this long, and they're following this literature and they believe it's the best available evidence, and it can turn out to be quite harmful. So that's how I generally answer that question.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now let's move on. I know you're anxious to talk about this, and everyone's anxious to hear. Tell us more about the risks and side effects. And I should add that one of the comments we had is that we need to end the term side effect for any effect that is prolonged and extreme, because temporary nausea, I think a lot of people consider a side effect, but sexual dysfunction, ongoing sexual dysfunction can be devastating, and a lot of people don't consider that a side effect, even though Big Pharma does. But with that said, let's dive into the risks and the side effects.
That's an excellent point. So I'm going to say adverse reactions or health effects.
Okay. Wonderful.
So if an antidepressant has any positive outcome, it's because it's an anxiolytic. It creates emotional numbing. So when you do surveys, when there's published surveys of the client's response to what they experience, and this is an interest of mine. I want to know what my clients experience when they take it. I don't want the preformed checklist. I want to know what it does in their lives.
Hmm.
Okay. About 70% say it creates an emotional numbness or detachment. Now, here's both the ethical and clinical question that we have to ask. Is that valuable? In any circumstance, can that be helpful? Most people know that is an adverse reaction. They don't like it because it doesn't only numb negative pain, it numbs all emotions and it impacts relationships. People feel like they don't feel as connected,
You don't feel joy? Do you feel joy or not?
muted.
Muted.
Now, again, not everybody. I mean, it's important for me to say that people have a range of reactions to this, but the overwhelming 70% of people are going to report like this muted experience, that they don't feel like they used to. And there's even published research that there's less empathy. And empathy is a very critical human emotion.
Huh, I'm interesting. I'm wondering if a lack of empathy might even, I'm really stretching here, might even contribute to the way we interact with each other on social media. A lot of the callous remarks that are made, very insensitive statements. Anyway,
There's a lot of critical questions you begin to ask when you start understanding, what these drugs do. So that's the most common reaction. There may be a small percentage of people who experience that as positive, and my guess is that's the people who are in the most intense emotional pain and or had a real difficult time getting out of their head. It seems like there's a drug effect that has this depressing quality on affect and cognition for some people. Okay. Now, most people will report that as an adverse reaction. There's a small percentage of people and say, well, that was beneficial or that was helpful. Okay. But again, like any drug, remember the brain is constantly adapting. We're seeking out homeostasis. These conditions tend to be short-lived. Now, if that's the best response, that it's an anxiolytic and it can have that response, that is in contradiction with what we know about other areas of psychological research, like in my field, that exposure to emotions is important in regulation. Feeling and understanding emotions are energy that has to be moved. Feeling is actually good, but if someone is really depressed and they feel like they can't regulate the intense sadness of the emotion and it becomes overwhelming to them, a reasonable person, a responsible person could say, yes, I can understand in certain settings, maybe even an emergency one, where if a drug has an anxiolytic effect and it depresses that and allows a person to feel a little bit better, that in the idea of trying to relieve human suffering, maybe there's some benefit to that. So let's put that as the potential benefit. Now, what are the harms? The harms are this, is the drug clearly increases suicidal thinking and creates worsening mood. So much so that during the trials, they had to remove suicidal clients because the drug was creating suicidal ideation. I do have something that's like pretty interesting that I found out, because I think what we have to do sometimes is we can't forget what's been promoted in the media in the past. And there was a 2000, let's say if I have that here, I think it was 2005. This was a CNN report that when it came to, I believe it was Zoloft, that Pfizer suppressed all this information to the FDA and to the general public, that it significantly increased suicidality in their patients. And so that's something, there's a black box warning for more than a double risk in suicide for anyone under the age of 25. So we do things that don't make sense. A young person who's still in an adolescent phase of their life, under the age of 25, there's still brain development. If they express suicidality or depression, we actually give them a drug that will more than double the risk of suicide. I believe it's much, much higher than that, because once you get out of the clinical trials and you look into some of the real world research, like the TAD study, it looks like there was a 4-time increase in suicidality. When it comes to Lexapro, for the treatment of as young as age 7, there was a 6-fold increase in suicidality. So it's very clear that these drugs induce suicidality in a percentage of the people that take it.
Are we doing are we doing an overlay to sort of track the increase in suicide among young people? It's been an epidemic with the uptake in SSRIs. Is there
Yes,
some correlation? Okay.
absolutely. I mean, I make that point rather consistently because our clinical decisions don't meet the science. So if somebody is suicidal, it does not make sense to give a drug that increases suicidality. An SSRI is an anti-suicidal pill. Okay, that's really, really important. Why someone may want to end their life is complex, and it often goes way beyond emotional pain. It's what is causing the emotional pain, the context of their life, their environment, their situation. So that's a very important adverse reaction. Another really important adverse reaction is there is a percentage of people that the drug has a stimulating effect, that it induces mania, or it induces akathisia. Akathisia is a physical symptom that makes people feel like their skin is crawling, like it's a restlessness. It's very, very painful. And so it's very interesting. Doctors and psychiatrists will still repeat this information, although it's lies. And, we talked earlier that, you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes collective truth. Well, the way that the marketing companies from the antidepressants spun the induction of mania from their drugs is they told the doctors that they had an underlying bipolar disorder. So we have this dramatic increases in bipolar disorder that are induced by a drug. And so there are people out there who have this very known drug reaction who walk around believing they have bipolar disorder and their doctors are telling them that. So that's another adverse effect. I think one of the most damaging, and there is a pretty wide scale, large movement of iatrogenically harmed patients who have post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. These drugs, which 70% report that numbness or detachment, a percentage of them are going to report that it also numbs the genitals. So they're unable to achieve orgasm, receive sexual pleasure. There's a decrease in libido, and it's a muting or numbness of all positive experiences. Now, if that was temporary and you can get off the drug and that could return, that's one thing. But we now know that it's permanent. So once you induce the drug, there's a percentage of people that never return to that previous functioning. And there's just a large, vocal, and angry group of people who feel completely invalidated as doctors still dismiss it. And I can definitively say this is a very clear, identifiable condition. Does it get research money? No, it does not. There is no incentive or motivation for anyone to research this. And so organizations are popping up.
Yeah,
The,
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
the other key point is what happens when you provide this drug to an adolescent in key sexual development years, where they numb their genitals, where they don't experience sexual attraction. What does that do to their own identity and the way that they define their sexuality or their gender or a number of things? So, I've been speaking about this for years because what I was seeing is I was evaluating like 25-year-olds who've been on this antidepressant for 10 years. Remember, it's only been evaluated for 8 to 10 weeks, but people are on it for 10 years. And they identify themselves to be asexual, or they don't identify with any particular gender because our sexuality is a part of our expression of who we are in many ways. And so there's like a lack of sometimes understanding of femininity or masculinity. There's a muting nature of the experience. And now they self-identify as if they're, gender dysphoric, or
Non-binary.
non-binary
Yes.
and asexual. And there's a rise there. And I can't help but say, if you're going to provide a drug that does that, why wouldn't we consider that that would be the consequence? And so I think those are critical adverse effects. Also, there are over 40 international drug regulatory warnings against violence.
I'm sorry, against what?
Against violence.
Against violence, yes.
They induce violent and homicidal reactions in a portion of people.
Oh,
Um, Underreported, but many of the school shooters were on one or multiple, psychiatric drugs. So you're inducing these dramatic shifts that changes the person's experience. You decrease empathy, you mute emotions, you create hostility, you create agitation. There's also psychosis is also a rare adverse effect, but they occur. Some of the people I've interviewed on my podcast, one gentleman murdered his own son after he was provided, I think it might have been Paxil for sleep. Person who has no history of any type of mental health condition is provided an SSRI for sleep, off label.
I'm sorry. Paxil isn't that like Ambien? Isn't that supposed to just simply induce sleep? That's not an antidepressant, is it? Or an
Paxil is an SSRI. It's paroxetine. Yeah.
And it induces sleep as well.
There's a wide range of responses. So yes, it can induce sedation in some people. It can do stimulating effects in others.
Okay.
But this gentleman was acquitted because it was determined that he had a metabolizing gene that didn't allow him to metabolize that drug. He was basically poisoned. So he had a toxic response to this drug. It's a genetic mutation in the metabolic gene of the CYP450 family, which you can test for. The biologist that I had on my podcast estimated that potentially about 7% of the population have that mutation of the metabolizing gene. So we think that if these drugs are prescribed to those people, their adverse reactions are much more severe. But that's not evaluated and that's not tested for.
I want to read a couple of comments here. One person said after they were put on SSRIs, they lost empathy and became more hostile. They remember being meaner to people online and in person. Furthermore, they know people in their own family who took antidepressants and became cruel. And we have another viewer who said they were prescribed SSRIs at the age of 16. It was after they were sent away from home to multiple boarding schools, and they felt depressed as a result of life traumas. Their parents approved the medication, and it was at boarding school that the medication was pushed on their parents. The parents tried to keep them on Celexa for a long time. This person now suffers many lasting side effects as a result. The question is, how should we hold the schools and psychiatrists accountable? How should we support people with these lasting effects? This person is, we're talking about how this affects young people at such an early age and beyond.
Yeah, I think we have a responsibility as consumers. We have a responsibility as professionals to have the highest standard of ethical care. And the only way that we're going to make changes is if the practicing physicians who violate informed consent are held accountable for their actions and their decisions. I've had way too many conversations with parents who've lost kids of suicide. Some of those conversations have been on my podcast. I've had Kim Witzak is a great example. Kim Witzak is a woman whose husband started a new job, had typical anxiety and some sleep problems related to starting a new job. His dream job put a lot of pressure on himself, goes to his family doctor, prescribed a SSRI, and he ended up ending his life. She saw the changes leading up to him. The doctor wouldn't reduce the dose. The doctor denied that it had anything to do with the drug, and he hung himself. These situations are they're rampant. They're not publicized, but they occur. They're real adverse effects. And I think other people mentioned on here, you used the word addiction. I'm going to use the word dependence. This is the other thing that's important for people to know is your brain adapts to it. It creates dependence. They were marketed to the American public as non-habit forming. There were Zoloft commercials and they said non-habit forming. So the doctors, up until recently, would communicate that these drugs do not create dependency. So what do? They wean them off the drug way too fast. What does that do? It induces withdrawal. For some people, it induces suicide. It induces psychosis, agitation, sleep problems. And then it gets misrepresented to them that it's a worsening or emerging depression. See, this is the reason you have to be on the SSRI because you're experiencing this. So people are told they have to stay on it for life when they were just experiencing known withdrawal reactions. We know a lot more now about how slowly you have to withdraw, you have to taper from SSRIs, and most doctors still don't do it. They don't have that knowledge. They're tapering their clients way too fast, and then people are misrepresenting their withdrawal as their depression is returning. And so it's just rampant misinformation out there.
So that gets us to a question I've gotten online and offline. What is your alternative treatment recommendation? Do you have suggestions for how to get off SSRIs safely? Because like you said, a lot of people are just weaned off way too quickly. Where can they go?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really challenging. There's something called hyperbolic tapering. And so anyone who's listening this can probably educate their prescriber. Hyperbolic tapering is like these 10% reductions per month. So it's a really, really slow reduction. And you have to do it under medical supervision and you have to do it safely and you have to be informed of what you may go through when you're going through withdrawal. If you're talking about alternatives, I mean, that's the very important question. I tell people that if you really are struggling with depression in the clinical sense, not the mild to moderate shifts in experience that most people are going to feel in response to stressors or adverse events over the course of the lifespan. If you really are experiencing severe depression, then there are options, right? There are mental health professionals and there are experts, and there are ways of working with people that can take time for them to understand what they're going through and to be able to make needed changes that might exist. The other thing, and this is very important too, is there's a lot of medical conditions that might mimic depression. Thyroid conditions, for example, like endocrine conditions, things that more and more people are experiencing as we're unhealthier than at any other point. And we're exposed to many toxic, not only medical interventions that exist, but there's a toxicity that exists in our environment and our food source. And so there are medical conditions that manifest themselves into like fatigue and low mood and sleep problems that get labeled with depression. So it's very important that you work with a competent medical professional who fully evaluates all these things and doesn't just slap the label of depression on you. If it is psychological, cognitive behavioral therapies tend to be the most effective because you're working with people in a very active way to be able to change their life and improve their coping. And I really do believe that the way and the manner in which we speak about depression as a culture needs to change, because I think a lot of people who get severely depressed feel horribly disconnected and feel like a burden. And there's a lot of judgment for their inner experience, and they think there's something wrong with them, and then the hopelessness induces. But somebody who can work with you to accept emotional pain, but also use it to benefit you, to see it as a point of transformation, to make changes behaviorally in a person's life, they tend to have much better outcomes than using drugs as a frontline intervention. And I think most reasonable people, even doctors who are prescribing these drugs, will say, I believe that that is probably the best option. However, that person can't get in anywhere, or that person can't find the right person. And I need to do something, and I need to give them something. And my response to that is just doing something, to say you're doing something without it being really safe and effective can be harmful. And so there's something called watchful waiting in primary care. Watchful waiting has had positive results. Remember, when we look at these clinical trials, we see that the placebo group gets better. Well, what's happening in the placebo group? It's not just the idea or the expectancy effect of the drug. It could be a lot of other factors that we're not accounting for, like the attention given by the medical professional, the follow-up, the taking that person's experience seriously, just being a compassionate ear, being a kind person, all the things that are, supportive for someone who's suffering.
Dr. McFillin, we have so many questions. I'm going to try to, in the last 10 or 13 minutes, I'm going to hit as many of them as I can. We should talk briefly about PSSD, which is post SSRI sexual dysfunction, I believe. This viewer said that they got PSSD after going on and off and on and off the medication the wrong way. You talked about the wrong way and the right way. And they said at the age of 22, their first sexual encounter with a woman his age who asked him out was ruined by the medication. So he wonders, how can people with PSSD, how do they handle it and reduce the effects? Are they permanent? Can they be reversed?
We don't know.
Okay.
And so it's really important for me to be responsible that, that's something we don't know. That's why it's so important that there is organizations that fund research and it becomes accepted by the medical community. There's things that pop up here anecdotally that provide us some degree of hope. And I would hate for anyone on this call to believe that what they're experiencing, there is no hope. We just need to learn more about it. There are people who, for all we know, spontaneously remit, right? They experience it for a period of time and then they don't, but I can't in any way explain why that may happen. So we need research, and we need to explore treatments, and those things are critically important.
So you talked about the large percentage of people who present with gender dysphoria. And we're also finding out that a large number of people with gender dysphoria have also been diagnosed with a mental health condition. So query how many of those are on SSRIs. But there's also, and this may sound like a tangent, but now that I'm listening to you, I think there's a link. There are so many young people who are on ADHD medications as well. And I know we're talking about SSRIs, but I'm wondering, are there similar adverse reactions to antidepressants? And might they also contribute to sort of the inhibition of sexual feelings and or gender dysphoria? A little off topic, but maybe related.
Well, it's actually a good question. And what you end up seeing in clinical practice, like when I'm doing the work that I do, is doctors will prescribe antidepressants, which will have some of those emotional blunting effects that kind of zap the person of their spirit, their human spirit, their ability to feel. And then they prescribe them stimulants to try to, it's like a series of uppers and downers. And then they're told that they have ADHD. But really, I think they're exhibiting a reaction to the drug, which varies in different people. And your psychiatry can sometimes be really just a series of uppers and downers trying to alter the person's experience. I mean, that's legitimately what it has become. I mean, it's much less scientific than what people may think.
Here's another question. How do you get someone who thinks their antidepressants are helping them, but they're actually experiencing adverse effects from the drugs? How do you get them to accept what is actually happening and that maybe it's the drug that's causing them to experience their symptoms? Especially when they're listening to and fully accepting the message that's being sent to them from the medical establishment saying that they need the drugs to help them with their depression and anxiety symptoms.
Yeah, I'll be honest, that's very, very difficult. But what I think my role is in situations like that, and of course I come across people like that who, I'll meet for initial evaluations. And so this is where informed consent's really important. I'll say to them, do you know that the drug has never been evaluated more than 8 to 12 weeks? Is there a plan for you to get off the drug? Since we don't study these drugs long term, there is some, yeah, there is some evidence that suggests that being on the long term, being on these drugs has some other adverse health effects, including metabolic conditions, metabolic illness, and
Such as,
if
I'm sorry, what metabolic illness, what might that look like?
yeah, like a pre-diabetes into diabetes,
Okay.
weight gain, heart disease. So, these drugs have been proven to create weight gain long term. And so you're bound, even if a person believes that the drug is helping them, and that belief is powerful. We know that belief is powerful. And that person is a consenting adult and chooses to go that route, they're still deserving of information. There are risks to you staying on it, including increasing the chronicity of depression. And the only way to really see how effective the drug is would you be willing to slowly taper off and go back to baseline? So this is the challenge that I have, is that I'll have somebody come into my office wanting to work with me because they're severely depressed, and I'll evaluation and I'll support that yeah, I think it's really impairing. They're really struggling. They're thinking about suicide. A lot of the aspects that bring life, its purpose and meaning, they've withdrawn from. And then I ask them about their previous treatment, and of course they inform me that they've been on an antidepressant drug for 10 years. And so I ask them, why would you stay on an antidepressant drug when you're clearly suffering and struggling this way? And almost universally, I get the same response: because I would be worse without it. That's a brainwashing, right? That's them hearing that from somebody else that's justifying staying on an antidepressant. If I went to a primary care doctor and I had strep throat and they gave me an antibiotic and I still had strep throat for 10 years, I'd be asking questions. But when it comes to mental health, there's almost a marginalization of this group of people. It's like you're broken. There's something wrong with you. You're sick. You have to manage this illness. And, this antidepressant is keeping you from even getting a worse depression. So people are like scared to get off it. And they actually convince themselves that it's doing something for them when there's no real objective evidence to support that.
Just wanted to go back, just a question someone asked earlier in the discussion. You mentioned that 20% of the population is on SSRIs. This viewer wanted to clarify that SSRIs are also prescribed for anxiety disorders, and the 20% of the population that's on SSRIs, it doesn't mean that they're all being prescribed for depression. Is this an understanding correct?
That's accurate. In fact, they're prescribed for a lot of conditions that they've never been formally approved for or evaluated. I'll give some other examples: bulimia, their anorexia, even, where it's very clear that the food is the medicine. Irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia. There's a range of conditions. People should also know that there's, SSRIs are not approved for postpartum depression, but they're routinely prescribed for postpartum mood changes. So, yeah, that person is absolutely right.
So you're saying that are pregnant women prescribed SSRIs as well? And have they
They-
been tested on pregnant women?
so not a Schedule C. It's identified as it's a drug that has been proven to be harmful in animal studies to fetuses and has never been studied in human populations. So I think you might be having Dr. Adam Urato on in the future.
Yes. Mhm.
I would really direct people to an in-depth analysis of that. The simple and quick question is, as we're running out of time, is that pregnant women and women of childbearing years are being inaccurately told that the drug is safe for their fetus, for their baby, and it is absolutely not.
Okay. All right, yes, we are running out of time. I would say in this last few minutes, what would you tell our audience about the best way to raise awareness among young people, especially often minors? They seem to be the biggest victims in all of this, who are being forced on life-changing medications, not just by their doctors, but oftentimes by their parents. How do we inform them? How do we set them on the right path? How do we give them support and inform them about the possible devastating and long-lasting effects of these drugs?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're in a position as patients um, that we have to do a lot of our own research. Like the veil has been lifted. The blind faith in the medical authority is over. That's one of the blessings of COVID, is there has been a revelation of the misrepresentation of science to the public, the blind trust we've given to our medical doctors. We believe they have a lot more independent, critical thinking and analysis of scientific data than they actually do. So there is now, there's podcasts, there's this event, even in the mainstream media, it's starting to get more attention, right? So it's really about making sure that people become educated, and we use all available resources that exist. The problem is we've talked before, Monica. There's not many in my field having these conversations. And if there's mental health professionals, there are therapists that are recommending these drugs. Therapists who've not one day looked into the science are telling their clients to go on antidepressants, not because they have any firsthand knowledge of their safety or efficacy, but just because they were told. And so we have to get medical professionals and therapists stop repeating things that aren't true. If you don't know it, don't speak it. You need to be held accountable. You need to be held responsible for the recommendations that you're making. I sit here in front of everybody humbly because I came to the conclusion that what I was seeing in front of me in clinical practice did not meet the narrative. And I felt a personal responsibility to do that research on behalf of my clients. There needs to be a shift that exists in our culture where, medical professionals and mental health professionals really do have a deep caring for the well-being of their patients, and develop this responsibility. But from a consumer's point of view, the general public, let's get on podcasts. Let's listen to the Radically Genuine podcast. Let's listen to podcasts where people around the globe are coming out and they're saying the same things that I'm saying because they've done that research. Go to functional medicine doctors who pull out of the allopathic medical system. Talk to naturopaths. Get your education. Get alternative perspectives, because it's the information that matters the most, and you deserve to be educated on it.
Dr. McFillin, thank you so much for being with us here tonight, and to all of our viewers. We're really, really so thankful and happy that you were able to join us, and we are especially grateful for your support. If you enjoyed tonight's discussion with Dr. McFillin, please consider subscribing to his podcast, the Radically Genuine Podcast. I believe it's available on iTunes and Spotify. Dr. McFillin?
Yeah, it's on wherever you're going to get your
Wherever.
podcast. And also, at my Substack I'm writing about a lot of these issues to drmcfillin.substack.com.
Perfect. And you can also learn more about Dr. McFillin's network, the Conscious Clinician Collective, at www.thecccollective.org. Anyway, Dr. McFillin, this has been such a valuable conversation, and I really hope you'll come back and join us sometime in the near future so we can continue it. And lastly, just like to remind all of our viewers, as I always do, that FAIR operates entirely on donations, and we do this through generous gifts from people like all of you watching and listening. And if you appreciate the work that we're doing, especially broadening the scope of FAIR and Med to tackle these really interesting and, I think, timely and so significant issues, and if you would like to help us continue doing it, please consider donating to FAIR and subscribing to our FAIR and Medicine newsletter. And you can find a link to our donation page in the chat. And once again, thank you all for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at the next FAIR and Medicine event. Take care, Dr. McFillin, and we'll see you in the future.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.